pimp of some sort. And when you look at Robert Tellis walking down the hallway, well, that gate looks very, very familiar, very similar to that. And so that's something that they wanted to see side by side.
Carter, while we're getting into the details, and not everybody has been following this, certainly nobody has been following it as closely as you have, I'm hoping that you can tell us a little bit more about the text messages and how they came to play in this trial.
Right. So what they were trying to do was determine if his alibi was accurate. And what prosecutors think is that Robert Tellis left his phone.
And Carter, I'm just going to pause you for one quick second.
Services.
Sorry, Carter. I'm just going to tell our viewers right now that this is a live image of Tellis arriving in the courthouse. So please continue.
Okay. So arriving into the courthouse right now, we were expecting the verdict to be read about 7 minutes ago. It will probably be read at any point right now. But again, a lot was revealed during this trial, and there was a lot of evidence that was mounting against Robert Tellis, and including hundreds of pictures that were found on his phone of the victim's home, his neighborhood, cars that looked like the victim's car. Yeah. There was a lot of evidence. There was also a straw hat that the killer was seen wearing. Well, a straw hat was found
Carter,
cut
apologies
up
for the interruption
home, so
again.
There's lots of evidence.
We'll come right back to you, but we want to listen into the courtroom now with the judge having entered the room as we prepare ourselves for the verdict the jury has found against Robert Tellis. So obviously the judge has returned to the courtroom, is reading documents. You see the defendant here, Robert Tellis, waiting to find out whether he's been found guilty of this alleged murder or has been cleared. He's now rising to hear the verdict. Let's listen.
Thank you, everyone. Please be seated.
Does the state stipulate to the presence of the panel as well as the two alternates? Yes, Your Honor. Mr. Jaskowitz?
Yes, Your Honor.
Thank you. Juror number 2, have you been selected to be the foreperson?
Yes.
Has the jury reached a verdict?
Yes, we have, Your Honor.
Will you please hand the verdict form to Officer Hawks? Okay, the clerk will now read the verdict form out loud. The defendant and his attorneys will stand for the reading of the verdict.
District Court, Clark County, Nevada, State of Nevada, Plaintiff versus Robert Tellis, Defendant, Case Number C-368935, Department Number 12, Verdict. We, the jury in the above entitled case, find the defendant, Robert Tellis, as follows. Murder with use of a deadly weapon, victim 60 years of age or older. Guilty of first-degree murder with use of a deadly weapon, victim 60 years of age or older. Special verdict. The jury unanimously finds the murder willful, deliberate, and premeditated. The jury unanimously finds the murder was committed by means of lying in wait. The jury unanimously finds the murder was committed by means of elder abuse. Guilty of first-degree murder with use of a deadly weapon, special verdict. The jury unanimously finds the murder willful, deliberate, premeditated. Do you want me to finish this?
I'm just going to have the attorney's approach for just a moment.
Thank you, Judge.
Because
All right, we just heard it. Guilty of murder with use of a deadly weapon. Now, this was a special charge in part because the victim was over the age of 60. We heard the foreperson, juror number 2, say that it was willful by means of lying in wait. We saw also Robert Tellis shaking his head no as the judge read that decision from the jurors.
And we also heard there the foreperson saying that they found Tellis guilty and that it was willful, deliberate, and premeditated, they say, the murder against against Mr. Gammon. Let's listen in to the judge's instructions.
So say you one, so say you all.
at this time, ladies and gentlemen, the clerk is going to ask you a question. I just ask that you respond yes or no.
Juror number 1 is, are these your verdicts as read?
Yes.
Juror number 2, are these your verdicts as read? Yes. Juror number 3, are these your verdicts as read?
Yes.
Juror number 4, are these your verdicts as read?
Yes.
Juror number 5, are these your verdicts as read?
Yes.
Juror number 6, are these your verdicts as read?
Yes.
Juror number 7, are these your verdicts as read?
Yes.
Juror number 8, are these your verdicts as read?
Yes.
Juror number 9, are these your verdicts as read?
Yes.
Juror number 10, are these your verdicts as read?
Yes.
Juror number 11, are these your verdicts as read?
Yes.
Juror number 12, are these your verdicts as read?
Yes. At this time, the clerk will record the verdict in the official record of the court. And at this time, ladies and gentlemen, as you know, pursuant to your verdict, we will now go into the penalty phase of the trial. We're going to take a break and allow the attorneys to get prepared for that penalty phase. So we will start again at 1:30. At this time, you'll all be able to be back together again. You're going to go with the court officer back to the jury deliberation room. And at 1:30, we will begin the penalty phase of this trial. Thank you very much, and you're excused.
Thank you. I'll run you back to the jury, please. Jurors, please go.
If you're just joining us, that's the reaction from Robert Tellis after discovering that a jury has found him guilty of murdering Jeff Gammon, an investigative reporter who had been critical of Mr. Tellis's work in office and was about to publish additional negative stories about him. We have our legal contributor, Jessica Levinson, joining us, and Carter Evans is outside the courthouse there in Las Vegas. Carter, tell us, now that we have this verdict of guilty, what type of reaction there may be there locally on a story that people have been watching so closely.
Well, you know, Justin, the people that I've been talking to since I've been in Las Vegas for the last couple of days, they seem to agree with the overwhelming evidence. They thought he was going to be found guilty. Pretty much everyone I spoke with thought that. What happens now is the penalty phase, and often in a court case that could be weeks, even a month later, but in this case it is going to happen today because the same jury is going to decide what the penalty is here, and he is facing up to life in prison. So we're going to hear victim impact statements after lunch in about an hour and a half now. Family members, friends of Jeff Gammon will get up and talk about how this has changed their lives, and the jury will consider all that when making its decision on how long to send Robert Tellis to prison for.
Yeah, and that penalty phase starting again at 1:30 local time. So a very quick turnaround, really. Tellis largely unemotional besides sort of shaking his head no as the judge read that verdict of guilty. Jessica, explain to us, this was a special charge in part because Jeff Gammon was older than 60. Can you explain to us a little bit more about how that is specific to Las Vegas?
It is. And this is a great question where we are now seeing, and partly through this trial, that criminal law is really a function of states. And this is why Robert Tellis, for instance, was able to testify in a narrative form, something I'm speaking to you from California, something many of us are not typically used to. That was a function of Nevada law. We are also seeing now that the charges look somewhat different. Not every state has an additional charge, which can mean additional jail time, obviously, based on the age of the defendant, where you saw that they found, obviously, this was a huge win for the prosecution, guilty on everything, including that additional charge related to the victim's age. And that's something that the prosecution would add on, frankly, because it's available. They thought it was appropriate and it could lead to additional prison time. So I think people are asking, well, if you could get a guilty on a first-degree murder charge, why would you have those additional charges? One, it's a belt and suspenders approach. Two, it could provide the prosecution with more leeway to say, we need more time here. As Carter very correctly pointed out, this is a case where we could see life in prison, and that shouldn't come as a surprise to anybody. There are, as we talked about, a lot of variations between state laws, state criminal laws, but when it comes to a guilty on this type of murder charge, you almost always see that you could spend the rest of your life behind bars.
And Jessica, stand by for us. We want to cross back over to Carter Evans, who's outside the courthouse. I know you may have to reposition at some time, but Carter, what has been the reaction that you're seeing from the jury and folks who were in the courtroom? We saw some women who were visibly emotional.
Yeah, you know, I think for the most part, this was expected. The women wearing red in the court had worked in Robert Tellis's offices. Those were the women that told Jeff Gehrman the news that he reported on. So they were here to support Jeff, and they are wearing red in support of him. We will probably hear from them today, but I wanted to point something out about the jury, because we talked about these things that were thrown at the jury in the last minute, and the makeup of the jury is important here. We know that more than one jury member has had a family member murdered, and one jury member also has a family member in jail for murder. So they can see all sides of this, and that could explain why this took some time to decide.
Very interesting, Carter. Do you know anything more about... oh, sorry, Carter, I'm told that we have to let you go there. Jessica, back over to you, though. As we're continuing to talk about this very odd case, help our viewers reset a little bit if they haven't been following this. Talk to us about what Gehrman was reporting on, why Tellis, after having lost his election, was potentially so angry, the motive that the prosecutors put together.
Well, this is a great question, because let's remember that there was not only a strong motive, but there was really strong evidence, as we've been talking about. So who were these people? We have Robert Tellis, who was basically a local elected official. And then we have a reporter, Gehrman, who was writing articles that were highly critical of Tellis, of how he ran his office, the idea that he created a hostile work environment, that he had an affair with a coworker. And again, generally speaking, the type of articles that Tellis just would not want to have out there in the public domain. Tellis then loses election, and he's no longer a public official. And according to the evidence, he also became somewhat obsessed with Gehrman, had lots of photographs of Gehrman on his phone, and spend a lot of time, let's say, focusing on Gehrman and potentially what he thinks Gehrman did to him. And that's where we see it looks like it's ripped straight from the headlines. That's where we see this motive, which I think is just stunning to most of us, because this is a reporter who was doing his job. This is the job, I don't need to tell you, of a journalist, right? To expose the truth, particularly when it comes to people who hold a position of trust in our society. And the idea that he could lose his life as a result of that is truly stunning. So first we have motive. Then, as we've been talking about, we really had overwhelming evidence. And I have to be honest, we talked before the verdict, but it's very, very difficult to overcome this level of evidence. It far exceeds, in my view, the evidence that we see in many cases throughout the country where we do reach jury verdicts. And that's ultimately what brings us to this moment where now the jury is going to decide what the punishment will be. But that was the background of this tale, the public official and the journalist who was writing articles critical of that official.
And we understand that the Clark County District Attorney is now addressing the media and the press. Let's see if we can cross over and listen into what's being said.
There was a lot of evidence in this case. There was a lot of video evidence. Some of their questions, they wanted an additional laptop. They wanted to look at some more of the video evidence. So I want to commend this jury. I think they took a lot of time to review this evidence. This is an important verdict. They gave the defendant in this case what he has a right to, which is an examination of that evidence. But at the end of the day, the jury did the right thing and came back with first degree with use of a deadly weapon, first degree murder with use of a deadly weapon, and both enhancements. This crime was committed with the use of a deadly weapon, and this crime was committed against an elderly person.
The jury kind of was throwing a curveball in closing with the defense there, basically pointing out the silhouette of a different looking person than Robert Tellis in the suspect's alleged vehicle there. How do you think that played into the big delay, or at least the length of time it took the jury to decide this? Because they had to go in the jury room and figure this out themselves.
Well, defense lawyers sometimes have to throw curveballs. That's their job. But I'll tell you, the jury hit the ball out of the park this time. They hit a home run by getting the right verdict.
Were you surprised by the length of the jury?
Yes, a little. To be candid, I think most everybody that followed this trial and watched this trial and was familiar with the evidence thought the verdict would come a little quicker. But again, there were over 400 exhibits. Many of these exhibits were video evidence. And I think the jury took their time and examined all of the evidence. That's what we want juries to do. We want them to look at all of the evidence. We want them to consider what the defense offers. But I'll say it again, at the end of the day, after looking at all the evidence, their verdict was clear and convincing.
Could you address him taking the stand, his defense?
Well, a defendant has a right to testify or choose not to testify. In this case, Mr. Tellis chose to testify. He gave narrative testimony. I think that the jury listened carefully. I was in the courtroom for a number of hours during this trial, and I was watching the jury. I was watching how the jury reacted to the evidence. And I think they gave Mr. Tellis the benefit of the doubt. They listened to him. Again, the jury verdict speaks for itself.
Do you think his decision to testify helped the verdict?
You know, maybe that's what we'll ask the jury one day when this is all over.
Mr. Wolfson, what is the significance of testifying by narrative? Have you ever had a case where you had a client, when you were a defense lawyer, testify by narrative?
It's certainly unusual. It is certainly rare. But sometimes, based upon the ethical rules that apply, a decision is made for a defendant to give a narrative.
What ethical rules might apply in a case like this?
I'm not going to speak to that at this point. You know, the case isn't over. We're going to a penalty hearing in about an hour. Certain witnesses will testify, and the jury still has another decision to render, and that's the decision of penalty.
What do you think is the appropriate penalty?
Well, they've got three options. They can come back with life without the possibility of parole, life with the possibility of parole after serving a minimum of 20 years, or a sentence of 50 years with minimum parole eligibility after 20 years. So the jury has options. I'm not going to invade the province of the jury at this time. I've got two excellent prosecutors that are going to present some information for the jury to consider. I'll respect whatever verdict, whatever sentence the jury comes back with.
Generally, in a case where you go to a penalty phase, what is it that a prosecutor is asking a jury to consider?
Well, during the guilt phase, they're asked to consider the evidence of guilt. You know, what evidence does the prosecution have to suggest that a crime was committed and that this accused person committed the crime? We're beyond that now. The jury came back with first-degree murder with use of a deadly weapon against an elderly person. So there's a different consideration now. What is the appropriate punishment? So I'm sure that Mr. Draskovich and Mr. Horvath will present information on behalf of their own client, and we will be presenting certain information that we want the jury to consider as well.
Forgive me if you answered this before I got here. What was behind the decision not to seek the death penalty in this case?
Well, there are certain cases that are appropriate for consideration of the death penalty and certain cases that aren't. A decision was reached that this was not an appropriate case to seek the death penalty.
I was asking why.
I'm not going to go into the analysis that went into that decision. I will tell you, in my 12 and a half years of being the district attorney, we have decided to file a death penalty in a number of cases, and we have decided not to file in a number of cases. Every case has its unique facts and circumstances, the background of the accused person, the gravity of the offense, the nature and circumstances. But a decision was made in this case not to seek the death penalty, but I'm confident that whatever sentence is rendered, that's a chunk of prison time that Mr. Tellis will have to serve.
Can you explain how the deadly weapon enhancement and the lying in wait factor could affect the sentence?
I didn't hear you, Caitlin.
Can you explain how the deadly weapon enhancement and the lying in wait factor could affect the sentencing?
Well, the jury's going to consider all of the evidence. I mean, this was a crime, in our opinion, that was clearly premeditated. There was planning involved. It wasn't a decision in a couple of minutes or moments to kill Mr. Gehrman. There was planning involved. Lying in wait, I think the jury will consider that. The jury will, of course, consider that he brought a deadly weapon. So they will consider all of these things in their decision.
Do you know Jeff Gehrman personally, and what can you say on a personal level about his work?
I knew Jeff for probably close to 40 years. He had a stellar reputation in this community. He was a zealot. He was an excellent investigative reporter. I did work with Jeff over the years. It's a crying shame, literally and figuratively, that he's no longer with us.
Sir, Mr. Tellis brought up a conspiracy theory that involved the private and public premiere.
I think they're ludicrous. There was no conspiracy. The only conspiracy was between him and his evil mind. All of the people that he accused of being part of a conspiracy had no role in any conspiracy, and I think the jury's verdict speaks directly to that. That's it. Thank you. Very good.
Well, we want to bring back in Jessica Levinson. We have just heard from the district attorney in Clark County, Steve Wilson, on the verdict that has now found Robert Tellis guilty of murder. Jessica, talk to us about what we heard from the prosecution about why they thought this was such a cut and dry case. And were you at all surprised about the idea that they didn't pursue the death penalty?
No, and it was interesting. He really didn't answer that. He said, we considered it, it was an option, and we didn't pursue it. And I think there are some reasons that you wouldn't want to pursue it. For instance, you need to pick a different jury when you have a death penalty case. You need a jury that is comfortable where if the penalty is death, then they can move forward. And there can be a whole host of, frankly, kind of procedural, administrative, and policy reasons why they wouldn't want to move forward with the death penalty. He didn't outline specifically which one, if any of those, was the most pressing for them. But oftentimes we increasingly see, I think, that prosecutors, where they know that life without the ability of obtaining parole or a very, very long sentence, particularly for somebody who's in their 40s, is on the table, that it's just not worth going through all the additional steps to try and seek the death penalty. And I suspect that that's probably what went on here. In terms of the rest of the press conference, I think what we see is a district attorney who's very satisfied and who knows that he had a very, very strong case. I mean, we talked about the motive. There really wasn't any question here. We have a journalist who's exposing bad behavior, corruption, and who is then killed by the target of those articles. And as we said, we just can't repeat enough the strength of the evidence, the idea that under Garriman's fingernails, you found Tellis's DNA. I mean, it truly doesn't get much stronger, again, than something like a videotape of the murder taking place. So that's what I heard, which is a prosecutor, frankly, that was relieved that they won a very winnable case. Because if they hadn't won this case, I don't know how else to put it other than I think something would have gone desperately wrong with the prosecution.
And it was interesting, Jessica, because we watched Carter, after speaking with us, turn to the district attorney and ask about this curveball from the defense, this image which seemed to show someone else. Lana made a good point that, look, he could have put on a wig to look like someone else. And the DA there said, look, if it was a curveball, the jury hit it out the park. They got this verdict right. To your point about motive and how the fact that Garriman was prepared to expose potentially an affair between Tellis and one of his colleagues, and the stabbing took place the day after Tellis found out that Garriman had text messages from colleagues exposing it all, really seemed to also just convince the jury that he was guilty. But it should also send a chill down any journalist's spine, because although it's unusual, it does happen usually in other parts of the world where journalists are killed for their reporting. This is a chilling case nonetheless.
There's no doubt about it. It is a horrifying case. Every murder is horrifying. And this is one where we're talking about it on TV. And we're talking about it on TV because you have something that sounds like it's made for, again, one of those true crime shows. And it's good in our country that this is a rarity. Let's emphasize that. It is a good thing that we are saying, we can't believe this happened to a journalist. As you correctly pointed out, that is not true everywhere else. And obviously the hope for all of us, because we depend on a strong press to hold our public officials accountable, the hope is that this doesn't chill anybody, that it doesn't make anybody think twice before they expose corruption or bad behavior. In this case, as you mentioned, there was not just the corruption, but there was also the impending news of an affair. And we know Tellis's personal and professional life were falling apart. So we just hope that this doesn't in any way become a pattern.
All right. Well, Robert Tellis now found guilty in the murder of Jeff Garriman. That heads to the penalty phase starting later today. Jessica Levinson, thank you.
And we also want to bring you an update on another legal story. A former police officer in the state of Massachusetts has pleaded not guilty to killing a woman that, according to reports, he is accused of sexually exploiting when she was underage, and staging the death as a suicide. So that's another very important case with developments we're watching closely for you as well.
A really horrific story. The woman was 23, found out she was pregnant. According to the allegations,